The night was cold, and the wind cut sharp as an axe edge, biting through cloak and beard alike. Yet still you pressed forward, boots sinking into a path made more mud than road, the scent of salt and smoke drifting from the distant coast. What it was like to visit a Viking tavern, and more, was not simply the warmth of fire or the lure of drink. It was the promise of stepping into the very heart of Viking life. Behind you stretched the fields and the sea, harsh and unyielding. But ahead, past the crooked huts and the creaking wharf, lay the hall where Vikings shed the weight of war and toil in favour of mead. Laughter and reckless boasting. The journey itself was half the trial. Rain had fallen earlier, leaving the earth slick and treacherous, and every cart rut threatened to swallow your boot whole. Smoke curled from low-roofed Viking houses, clustered together, like survivors clinging for warmth. But the sound you followed was louder than any hearth. Laughter, the clamour of mugs, the echo of Viking voices rising in song, this was the beacon that drew you on. The closer you came, the thicker the air grew with the promise of roasted food. Fatty pork dripping onto open flame, fish pulled fresh from the fjord and charred until the skin cracked. Bread dense enough to still a hunger earned on raid or field. You passed a group of Viking men already swaying with drink outside the door, one clutching his horn of ale like a battle trophy, another shouting oaths to the night sky as though Odin himself might answer. A pair of Viking women lingered nearby, shawls pulled close, their sharp eyes measuring every man that staggered past, weighing coin, strength, or folly in the glint of firelight. Then, at last it loomed the tavern, though a Viking would call it the mead-hall, the true heart of the settlement. Its roof of timber and turf sloped heavy with age, and carved beams stood like guardians, their runes whispering protection against spirits and foes alike. A shield hung above the doorway, battered and split, a promise that within these walls every Viking, farmer or warrior shared the same fire. The door itself resisted, heavy and iron-bound, but once you pressed it open, the world outside vanished. Heat slammed into you first, a wave of smoke and mead-thick breath. Then, sound Viking voices roaring in chorus, the crack of mugs on wood, the pounding of fists in rhythm with song. Shadows leapt across beams blackened by centuries of fire, and the great hearth burned at the hall's centre, spilling light and life into every corner. Your heart quickened, for here you were not just another wanderer on a muddy road. You had stepped into the pulse of the Viking world, where oaths were sworn, songs were forged, and the line between feast and fight blurred as easily as the smoke drifting to the rafters. This was no mere tavern. This was a Viking night, alive and merciless, waiting to claim you. The night in a Viking town does not guide you with signs or markers. There are no carved boards to tell you where to go, no lamps to chase away the darkness. The earth itself is black and slick, and the wind howls through the narrow lanes like a wolf in hunger. To find your way, you follow the living thread that winds through every Viking settlement. The laughter, the shouting, the song carried rough and bold through the storm. It is the hearth of the town you seek, the place where Viking men, hardened by sea and sword, throw down their burdens and lift their horns. The smell of it reaches you before the firelight does. Viking smoke, heavy with pine pitch, clings to the air, mingled with the unmistakable scent of Viking brew ale, strong enough to burn the chest and mead thick with honey that clings to the tongue. Beneath it lies food, stews rich with fat, salted fish, roasted goat, and bread blackened by fire. The scents pull at your gut as surely as the noise pulls at your ears. The hearth is not hidden, it is calling, like a beacon made of hunger and desire. As you move closer, the voices grow distinct. A Viking laugh, rough and booming, erupts like a war cry. Another voice rises in song, a skald spinning tales of Viking heroes who braved the seas and broke kings beneath their axes. The rhythm of mugs pounding wood joins in, a drumbeat of fellowship that makes the blood stir even before you step inside. The hall looms ahead at last. A mead-hall, wide and proud, its roof carved with dragon heads that leer at the night sky. Smoke pours from the hole in its crown, glowing with embers that rise like sparks into the wind. The walls are scarred timber, thick as shields, braced against storm and time. This is no mere house. It is the heart of Viking life, the forge of Viking spirit, where blood brothers are made and rivalries are settled by steel or by drink. Closer still, you see shapes at the threshold. Viking men wrapped in cloaks of wool and fur, their faces ruddy with drink, bellowing as they spill out into the mud for a fight, or perhaps a laugh. A Viking woman, sharp-eyed and steady, strides past them with a tray of mugs, dodging their grasp with the skill of one who has seen 100 nights just like this. Even the dogs linger near the doorway, Viking hounds with shaggy coats, waiting for scraps of meat or bread to fall into the mud. And then you know you have found it, the hearth of the Viking town, the place where no storm can touch you, where the cold dies at the threshold and the night opens into fire and feast. One step more, and the hall will swallow you whole into the roar, the heat, the endless pulse of Viking life. The first sight of the mead-hall strikes like a hammer to the chest, a sight both grim and glorious. Rising out of the dark like the ribs of some slain beast, the timbered hall looms high, its roof pitched steep against the night sky, its beams carved with snarling dragons that seem ready to leap down upon any who dare approach. This is no common shelter. This is the heart of Viking life, the place where Viking men return from storm and sword, where Viking women rule the hearth with sharp eyes and sharper tongues, and where the pulse of the settlement beats loudest. Torches spit and crackle along the outer posts, their flames licking at the carvings until the beasts writhe in shadow. The walls, darkened by years of smoke, shine in patches where rain slicks down the grain of the wood. Shields hang along the entrance, Viking shields rimmed with iron, scarred by old blows but polished enough to catch the torchlight and glint like watchful eyes. Each one tells of raids, of battles, of blood spilled, and Viking honour won. The hall itself leans slightly with age, but that tilt only makes it seem more alive, as though the very structure shares in the drunken swagger of those inside. As you near, the door shudders against the force of noise behind it. A Viking chorus, booming laughter, clashing mugs, voices rising in songs, half prayer, half boast, slams through the cracks like the roar of a sea storm. The scent is already thick in the air. Viking food roasting, fat dripping from boar and venison. Viking ale, sour and strong, soaking into the straw at the threshold. Viking sweat, heavy and sharp, seeping from every man pressed shoulder to shoulder within. It is foul, it is fierce, and it is alive. The ground before the hall is trampled to muck, churned by the boots of Viking warriors, farmers, and thralls alike, all drawn to the glow as moths to flame. A one-eyed dog gnaws a bone near the entrance, growling low at anyone who dares glance at it. A pair of Viking men stagger out into the night, one laughing with blood on his lip, the other swearing vengeance only to be pulled back by the arm of a woman who drags him away like a prize too drunk to resist. Yet, even these scraps at the edge feel like part of the greater whole, the raw vitality spilling from the hall itself. The doorway looms now, its heavy planks bound with iron, the handle worn smooth by generations of Viking hands. Beyond it lies more than warmth, more than drink. Beyond it lies the marrow of Viking life, the place where tales are forged, where feuds are sparked, where oaths are bound, and where every man, woman, and wanderer is measured not by wealth, but by courage, laughter, and the strength of their drinking arm. The mead-hall does not invite, it commands. And as you stand before it, with torchlight flickering on shields and dragon carvings snarling above, you feel it already. The door is a beast in itself, thick planks bound with iron, swollen by years of storms. You lean your shoulder into it, and with a groan like an old tree it yields, swinging wide to spill the fury of the hall into the night. At once the storm is behind you, forgotten. Heat surges forward, wrapping you in its embrace, thick with smoke, sweat, and the sharp bite of Viking ale. The sound is a wall of life, a chorus of Viking voices roaring in laughter, bellowing in argument, chanting half-songs and broken sagas. Inside, the world is transformed, raw and alive, a Viking hearth blazing against the endless dark. The first breath fills your chest with fire, smoke clings low beneath the rafters, and the smell is heavy, a Viking feast in the making boar turning on a spit, its fat dripping into flame, mingling with the salt of dried fish and the sour-sweet sting of fermented mead. The floor trembles beneath Viking boots as men slam their horns together, ale spilling over, soaking the straw that already reeks of countless nights. It is chaos, yet not without order, for every Viking knows his place at the bench, and every Viking knows when to drink, when to boast, and when to be silent under the gaze of the gods. Your eyes adjust, drawn to the long fire blazing down the hall's centre, its light carving the faces around it into gold and shadow. Viking men sit shoulder to shoulder, their cloaks steaming from the storm, their beards wet with ale and broth. Some slap their knees in laughter, others wrestle with words as fierce as blades, daring rivals to match their boasts of raids across seas, of gold taken from foreign shores, of Viking courage that never bent to fear. The air is thick with pride, as if the sagas themselves walk among them. Viking women move through the press, carrying horns of mead, setting down bowls of steaming pottage, their eyes sharp as a hawk's. Some laugh with the men, others scold with quick tongues and quicker hands, reminding every Viking fool that the hall belongs as much to them as to warriors. Children cling to skirts or weave between benches, gathering scraps, wide-eyed at the sight of Viking men flushed with drink, their voices rolling like thunder. At the high seat near the fire's heart, the Viking host raises his horn. His presence steadies the storm, his voice carrying above the din like the crash of waves on rock. It is he who keeps the order, he who decides who drinks deepest, and he who commands the silence when a skald steps forward with song. You step further in, boots sinking into straw, cloak heavy on your shoulders, but already you feel it, the pull of belonging. The threshold has been crossed. The storm is outside, and here is warmth, ale, and the wild pulse of Viking life. This is no simple hall. This is a Viking tavern, the heart of the village, where every voice, every story, every song binds you into the fierce brotherhood of the north. The first breath inside nearly chokes you, for the air of a Viking tavern is not meant to be delicate, it is meant to be endured. It clings to the tongue, heavy and thick, as though you could chew it like gristle. Wood smoke swirls in every corner, stinging the eyes and weaving through the beams blackened by years of fire. The sour tang of Viking ale rides atop it, sharp and pungent, soaked into the very floor where spilled horns have fed the dirt more than seed ever could. Damp Viking furs hang across shoulders and benches, steaming from the wet night outside, their musk filling the hall until it is impossible to tell where man ends and beast begins. The air is alive with Viking breath, warm, stale, and spiced with mead. Each inhale tastes of 100 voices, shouting, laughing, singing, all bound into a storm that refuses to quiet. Near the hearth, the scent deepens into roasted Viking food, fat dripping into flame, sending out waves of heat that battle the winter pressing at the walls. The smell of charred meat mingles with the sour tang of boiled onions and bread tough as oak bark. Viking men slap their mugs down, splashing the brew across the tables, their laughter booming like war horns, while Viking women weave between them, quick-eyed and sharp-tongued, carrying fresh horns of mead with the stride of queens. Even the straw at your feet reeks of trampled boots, spilled stew, and the sweat of Viking bodies pressed too close together for comfort. It is no single stench, but a tapestry, woven of every moment, lived within these walls. The sweetness of honey mead drifting from one horn, the sting of piss wafting faintly from a corner where a drunk Viking decided the straw was good enough, the lingering copper bite of old blood, scraped half clean from the floor. Each note clings to the other until the whole hall breathes like a Viking beast rank, hot and utterly alive. The longer you stand in it, the more it seeps into you. Cloak, skin, hair, all surrender to the hall's perfume, so that when you leave, the world outside will know where you have been. And yet, for all its foulness, there is something strangely welcome in it. The air of the Viking Tavern is a bond, proof that you are no longer in the storm alone, but swallowed into the belly of fellowship. Here, the smell of sweat and smoke means warmth. The sour bite of ale means survival. The rank press of bodies means you are among kin and strangers alike, who live hard, drink harder, and fear nothing. The air may choke you, may drown you, but it also claims you. This is no air for the hall may thunder with the voices of Viking men, may ring with the laughter of Viking women, may rattle with the clash of mugs and the scrape of Viking blades against tables. But make no mistake, there is only one ruler here, not the Jarl, not the Huskarl with his scarred hands, not the drunken warrior boasting of Viking raids across the sea. The true law of the hall belongs to the ale-keeper. Their presence is felt before their voice is heard, before their hand slams down a horn of Viking mead, or their ladle swings at a troublemaker's skull. The ale-keeper is the spine of the tavern, and without them, even the proudest Viking feast would crumble into ruin. This keeper of the hall does not wear a crown, yet every Viking man lowers his voice when that sharp glare finds him. Some are broad-shouldered, built like Viking shields hammered into flesh. Others are lean as Viking spears, but all carry the same weight of command. They have seen every kind of night, a Viking wedding thick with joy, a Viking funeral drowned in sorrow, a blood feud broken loose over dice. None of it shakes them. Their eyes cut through smoke and song alike, measuring each man and woman as a trader weighs silver on a scale. Behind the plank of a bar, if it can even be called that, they move with the precision of a Viking shipmaster steering through storm. Horns are filled, bowls are slapped down, debts are remembered with a mind sharper than any rune. Viking food comes out steaming, thick pottage, charred meat or salted fish dragged up from the fjord. Viking ale flows steady, sometimes sweet, sometimes bitter, always enough to drown fear or sharpen courage. Yet nothing is free, not even for the fiercest Viking warrior who claims to have split skulls on foreign soil. The ale-keeper remembers who paid, who promised, and who thinks his Viking pride can pass for coin. And woe to the fool who mistakes the hall's chaos for weakness. The moment a Viking man grows too bold, swinging fists or grabbing where he should not, the ale-keeper's hand comes down swift. Sometimes it is the crack of a ladle, sometimes a mug shattered against a thick Viking skull. More than one Viking raider, drunk on mead and arrogance, has been hauled by the scruff of his tunic and thrown into the mud outside, left to cool like a gutted fish. Inside the hall, the keeper's word is iron, heavier than the Jarl's decree, for the Jarl rules lands and ships, but the ale-keeper rules tonight. Still, for those who honour the hall, who treat Viking drink with respect and Viking company with measure, the ale-keeper is no enemy. A nod from them means safety, a full horn means favour, and a whispered tale shared over the counter may hold more truth than a Viking lawman's oath. They are the silent scolds of the night, holding the secrets of Viking. The first thing a stranger learns in a Viking tavern is that drink is not a luxury, it is survival. Water, though clear, often carried death in its flow, and so Viking men, Viking women, even Viking children, raised mugs not of water but of ale. The hall itself seemed to breathe with it, the scent of barley and honey drifting as thick as smoke. To taste Viking mead or Viking ale was to taste the very blood of the north. Viking ale was no delicate brew. It was thick, cloudy, drawn from great wooden casks stored in the back of the hall. Grain steeped in smoky water, boiled in kettles, blackened by years of fire, left to rest in barrels that groaned as if alive. When poured, it foamed and frothed, carrying with it the bite of yeast and the heaviness of earth. Viking men drank it in deep gulps, wiping froth from their beards with the back of a hand, laughing through bitter coughs, and slamming their mugs upon the table so hard the hall shook. But it was Viking mead that carried the true spirit of celebration. Brewed from honey, gathered in wild combs, golden and rich, it flowed like liquid fire. Sweet on the tongue, burning down the throat, it was the drink of both warrior and skald. Viking mead was said to hold poetry itself in its depths, giving courage to men who swore oaths and loosening the tongues of Viking women who sang or bargained beneath the rafters. A horn of mead, lifted in the glow of the hearth, was more than a drink. It was a promise, a challenge, a spark that could turn a night into legend. There was cider too, pressed from apples when the harvest was kind, sharp and biting as winter wind. Some halls carried sour wine, traded up from the south, though it was often watered thin, fit more for mockery than for pride. Still, it was poured, for a Viking tavern never let a vessel go empty. Even the poorest could raise a cup of something warm, if not good. Children, too, were given weak ale, for in Viking lands it was safer than the wells. From the youngest thrall to the oldest farmer, all shared the same drink, each sip tying them to the hall, the hearth, and each other. It was drink that fueled Viking feasts, that hardened Viking warriors before battle, that sweetened Viking weddings, and that steadied trembling hands at funerals. In every moment of Viking life, a mug or a horn was near. Raise it high, then. In the mead-hall, drink was not simply to quench thirst. It was to bind Viking to Viking, to seal words into oaths, and to drown the silence of winter in fire and fellowship. In the glow of torches, with ale on your breath and mead in your veins, you were not just alive, you were Viking. The Viking Tavern is no place for dainty meals or delicate fare. Here, food is as rough and honest as the men and women who swallow it, carved from the same world of smoke, iron, and hunger. Viking food was not about pleasing the tongue. It was about filling the belly, feeding warriors, thralls, and wanderers alike, giving them strength to lift the axe, pull the oar, or simply survive another bitter dawn. When you sit at a Viking table, you do not expect choice. You expect what the land, the sea, and the season have given, and you thank the gods if it is hot and enough to chew. The mainstay is pottage, a Viking stew thick enough to hold a spoon upright, simmering in the same iron pot for days, each night receiving a handful of barley, a few onions, perhaps a scrap of meat if fortune favoured the hunt. It tastes of smoke, earth, and survival. Viking thralls eat it, Viking warriors eat it, and even the Viking chieftain takes his share, though perhaps with more meat than grain. Into the pot go roots, beans, peas, and whatever beast wandered too close to the spear, a hare, a pigeon, or if the gods are generous, a chunk of boar. Bread comes with every meal, though calling it bread is generous. Coarse, dark, and heavy, Viking bread is ground from barley or rye, baked hard enough to break a tooth if left too long. Sometimes it is flat and scorched from a stone hearth, other times thick and damp, better suited to soaking stew than standing alone. Yet no Viking meal is complete without it, passed down the bench in rough loaves, torn by hand, and shared without question. The bread binds the food together, and in lean winters it is the only thing between a Viking family and the hunger that waits outside the hall. Fish fills the gaps. Viking men haul it from sea and river, Viking women salt and smoke it, and thralls dry it stiff as leather to last through the months when the fjords freeze. Dried herring, cod, or salmon hang in the rafters, stripped thin, chewed like wood, chased with ale to soften its bite. It is not feasting food, but it keeps Viking bellies from gnawing themselves hollow, and for that it is as precious as gold. But sometimes, when fortune smiles, the hall erupts in the joy of a true Viking feast. The spit turns slowly, dripping fat into fire as a whole pig roasts, skin cracking, the smell rolling through the hall until every Viking warrior pounds the table in hunger. Venison, goose, and on rare nights, beef. These are the moments the sagas remember, when Viking men eat until their belts strain, and Viking women laugh over platters of steaming meat, and even the thralls gnaw bones with joy. In the Viking tavern, food is never just food. It is strength for battle, comfort for sorrow, a gift of life carved from a harsh land. Each bowl of stew, each crust of bread, each bite of fish is a reminder that the mead-hall breathes in rhythm and its heart beats along the long benches. Rough-hewn planks stretch the length of the hall, sagging under the weight of Viking men, Viking women, and the food and drink that sustain them. There is no room for solitude here. Elbows press into ribs, shoulders grind against damp furs, and every seat is claimed by those bold enough to fight for it. A Viking does not sit in comfort, he claims his place with his presence, with his voice, with his horn raised high above the din. To sit among them is to be pressed into the living fabric of the hall, woven tight by heat, hunger, and ale. The benches tell their own stories, scarred by knives drawn in anger or idleness, carved with runes spelling out names long forgotten, gouged by fists and teeth of steel. They are chronicles of Viking nights past. Here, someone marked a prayer to Odin before sailing to raid the south. There, a jagged rune of victory etched by a warrior drunk on triumph and mead. Blood has darkened the wood in more than one place, stains ground into the grain by years of boots and spilled ale. Each scar is a memory, a shadow of some Viking quarrel, oath, or laughter that once shook these walls. The tables groan beneath the weight of Viking food platters, of meat torn apart by hand, bread like stone wheels, and steaming bowls of pottage ladled out to fill the bellies of both warrior and thrall. Horns and mugs clatter across the boards in drunken rhythm, each slam of wood against wood a defiant echo of Viking life, lived loud and unashamed. The smell of roasted boar mingles with sour ale and sweat, sinking into the timber so deeply that even when the hall stands empty, it reeks of feasts long ended. There is no division finer than the benches themselves. The Jarl and his chosen warriors take the high seat at the far end, their places marked with furs and finer carvings, where the light of the fire strikes brightest. But even here, the benches remind the mighty they are still among their own kind, for no Viking sits truly apart. The lowliest fisherman may press shoulders with a shield brother fresh from battle, and a Viking woman carrying a tray of mugs strides past them all, her eyes daring any to block her way. Rank may rule the land outside, but on the long benches, the closeness of flesh and voice makes all men equal in the haze of smoke and drink. You sit, pressed tight, between strangers who are strangers no longer. One shouts a boast in your ear, his breath hot with mead. Another slams a knife into the table to carve a rune beside your hand. Laughter explodes across the bench, shaking mugs, shaking shoulders, shaking the very boards beneath your feet. This is the Viking hall at its core. The sound of the hall is the sound of life itself, and to step into it is to drown in a storm no sea could match. A Viking tavern is never quiet, for silence belongs to grave mounds and cold fjords, not to a place where blood still runs hot. The air shakes with roaring laughter, Viking men pounding their fists upon tables as they boast of battles, hunts, and voyages across the whale road. Mugs clash like shields in their hands, the hollow thud of wood echoing with every toast, every oath shouted to gods and kin. It is a sound that rolls like thunder, rising and falling, never still. Viking women join the chorus, their voices cutting sharp and clear through the din, mocking, singing, or challenging men twice their size. They carry jugs of ale and mead with a strength equal to any warrior. their steps steady even as drunken Viking men sway in their seats. They laugh with defiance, scold with fire, and sometimes silence a fool with nothing more than a look sharper than a spear. When their voices ring, the hall bends to them, and the sound takes on new shape. The music of the hall is rough, born from Viking throats that know more of war cries than harmony. Chants roll across the benches, verses half remembered, but carried with such power that the words hardly matter. The rhythm comes from pounding fists, from knives striking wood, from boots stomping the floorboards until the hall itself seems to join in. Now and then a harp is strummed, a drum beaten, but they are swallowed quickly into the greater roar, the voice of Vikings gathered as one. And yet, amid all this, silence can fall like a blade. A sudden quarrel sparks one Viking man, accusing another of lies, a boast struck too hard, a jest taken as insult. The laughter dies, and the hall holds its breath. You can hear the crackle of the fire, the drip of spilled ale onto the floor, even the sound of a knife being loosened in its sheath. These silences are heavy, dangerous, charged with the weight of Viking pride. They last only heartbeats, but in those heartbeats, the fate of men can turn. A laugh might break the tension, and the hall roars again, or blood may be spilled, and the night remembered in darker tones. The sound of the Viking hall is not merely noise, it is memory. It is proof of being alive. Every roar, every chant, every clashing mug declares that the Vikings endure, that they defy the cold, the hunger, the endless night. To sit in such a storm is to feel the strength of a people who refuse stillness. The din of the Viking tavern stills when the skald rises. Not fully, never fully, for Vikings are not a people to sit silent, but enough for the bard's voice to carve through the storm. It rises like steel ringing against steel, carrying above the clash of mugs and the growl of arguments. The skald is no mere singer. He is memory, pride, and fire given shape. In his throat lives the saga of Viking men who crossed seas wider than dreams, who swung their axes until kingdoms bent, and who ate Viking food with the hunger of wolves before setting out again. The hall leans toward him, even the rowdiest Viking drunk drawn by the weight of words. His verses tumble with rhythm, half history, half boasting, yet every word sparks like flint in the soul. A Viking woman straightens to listen, her eyes flashing with pride at names she knows. A Viking thrall pauses with bread in hand, forgetting the taste of it as heroes march from the skald's lips into the smoke-thick air. The skald is not simply telling, he is weaving, binding the hall together with tales that remind them who they are. He sings of oaths sworn under pale moons, of ships with dragon prows cutting through black seas, of Viking kings who fell with swords still warm in their grip. His words lash against the beams, stirring even the wearied into a fresh hunger for glory. Every Viking who hears them feels the weight of blood and bone behind the sagas, for these are not stories of far-off lands. They are the lifeblood of their people, their kin, their gods. The skald's hand beats the rhythm against his harp, each note sharp as an axe blade. He does not beg for silence, he takes it. Even when the noise of the Viking hall swells, his voice climbs higher, fierce as a storm wind, demanding to be heard. At times, he pauses, letting the crowd erupt, cheers, fists, and horns raised high, as if the Vikings themselves must finish the verse. At other times, he lowers his tone to a growl, so the listeners lean in, breath held, desperate not to miss the next word. It is more than music. It is a spell, one that turns coarse bread into a feast, common ale into the nectar of gods, and weary warriors into dreamers of conquest. By the skald's tongue, even the poorest Viking farmer feels the greatness of the longships in his chest. Even the humblest Viking fisherman hears the call of Valhalla in the smoke. And when the final verse falls, the roar that follows shakes the rafters. The Vikings slam their mugs, their voices joining as one. The fire burns low, but the voices grow higher, This is the hour when Viking men turn to boasting, when their words swell larger than their deeds, and the tavern becomes a battlefield of tongues. Horns of Viking ale slam against the tables, froth spilling like foam on the prow of a ship, as warriors lean forward with eyes blazing and fists pounding. Each tale is hurled like a spear across the benches, daring another to match it, or better yet, to fall short. One Viking rises, his beard still crusted with sea salt, and swears he once cleaved 3 men with a single stroke. The crowd erupts in laughter, but he pounds the board again, swearing upon Odin's ravens that his blade still carries their cries. Another Viking shouts of the time he sailed farther north than any man dared, into waters where the ice clawed at the hull, and the night swallowed the Sunday. The hall shivers at his words, but before the silence grows long, a younger Viking leaps to his feet and mocks him, claiming the only ice he braved was what clung to his beard after falling into a frozen stream. The benches shake with mirth, and yet the sting of such words lingers like smoke. Boasts are not idle chatter, they are wagers of honour, and in the Viking world, words can cut as deeply as steel. Men swear oaths in the heat of drink, oaths to raid a distant land, to slay a rival beast, to win the hand of a Viking woman, famed for her beauty or her scorn. These promises, born in fire and ale, bind tighter than chains. To break them is to wear shame heavier than armour, and no Viking can live long beneath that weight. The air thickens as voices rise. Some oaths are met with cheers, horns lifted high in approval. Others stir unease, for all know that an oath spoken too boldly may demand blood before the dawn. More than one Viking has found himself drawn into a duel not because of insult, but because his own tongue dared the gods to witness him. The tavern keeper watches with narrowed eyes, knowing that tonight's oaths may become tomorrow's corpses carried out beneath the morning Sunday. Yet there is glory in it too. Viking men crave the weight of their own words, to feel themselves immortalized in the memory of the hall. Each boast plants a seed in the minds of those who hear it, and if the deed is later done, the tale is sung louder for the fire it sprang from. The benches thunder, the rafters groan, and the night is alive with Viking voices, their boasts and oaths as fierce as any raid upon a foreign shore. In this hall, in this moment, a Viking's tongue is both his sharpest weapon and his most dangerous curse. In the smoky glow of the Viking tavern, when the songs have dimmed and the boasts still echo, another hunger stirs among the Viking men. It is not for Viking food or Viking mead, but for chance for the rattle of bones and the thrill of fortune's hand. Dice and knuckle bones, carved smooth from sheep and ox, are flung across scarred tables, their clatter sharp as steel on shield. The Viking warriors lean in close, eyes burning with the same fire they carry into battle, for in this moment fate lies not in the swing of an axe, but in the turn of bone. Silver arm rings gleam in the firelight, stacked upon the table as wagers. Viking weapons, prized knives and axes, are laid down as stakes, their edges catching the torchlight like promises waiting to be kept. Even cloaks, belts, and boots change hands in the fever of the game. To lose is shame, to win is glory, and every Viking knows that the gods smile or sneer on both alike. The Viking women watch from the benches, some laughing at the reckless wagers, others urging their kin to greater stakes. A farmer may gamble away the hides he traded, while a Viking thrall, emboldened by mead, risks the few coins he has scraped together. The dice roll for all, for in the tavern's heart there is no rank that cannot be undone by fortune. Tension coils with every throw. When the bones fall well, the benches erupt, Viking men pounding the table, mugs spilling in approval. When they fall poorly, curses fly, and hands drift too near hilts. The air grows thick with daring and danger, as though Odin himself leans in to watch which way the dice will tumble. But the game is not only for wealth. Wagers stretch into the marrow of Viking pride. A man may stake an oath upon his throw, that he will raid further come spring, or fight the strongest in the hall at dawn. Victory means honor magnified, while defeat binds him to his vow, no matter the cost. Thus, the dice carry weight far beyond their size. They are the bones of destiny, rattled and cast beneath the eyes of all. The night grows longer, the wagers wilder. Some leave richer than when they entered, weighed down with Viking silver and spoils. Others depart, stripped bare of more than coin, their pride cut down by chance itself. Yet all return, for the lure of the bones is as strong as the pull of the sea. And so, the Viking Tavern breathes not only with laughter and song, but with the gamble of fate itself, dice and bones rolling across the tables. Viking voices. The hall was not the domain of Viking men alone, though their roars and boasts shook the rafters. The women of the mead-hall moved among them with a quiet strength that needed no shouting. Viking women bore the horns of ale with steady hands, their steps sure upon floors slick with mead and smoke. Their presence bound the chaos, for without them the Viking tavern would have collapsed into madness. They were not shadows to the warriors, they were fire at the edges of the blaze. Some Viking women sang, voices clear and sharp as the northern wind, rising above the clash of mugs and the bellow of Viking men. Their songs twined with those of the skalds, sometimes softer, sometimes sharper, weaving tales of heroes and gods, or mocking verses that could humble a Viking warrior more swiftly than any blade. Laughter followed them, but beneath it lay respect, for their tongues were quick and their words struck home. Others bargained in the corners, cloaks drawn close, silver arm rings slipping between their fingers as they bartered for goods or gambled at dice. A Viking thrall might hope to win his freedom with the favour of such a woman, while a Viking trader might find himself outmatched in wit and leave with his purse lighter than he had planned. Their sharp eyes missed nothing the roll of a bone, the glint of hidden envy, the whisper of a plot forming in the smoky corners of the hall. Even when they only watched, their gaze carried weight. A Viking warrior boasting too loud might falter under the steady look of a woman at the benches, knowing that his words would live or die in her memory. For to be praised by Viking men was fleeting, but to be remembered by Viking women was to have one's name carried into song and story. And should steel flash in anger, these women did not flinch. They had seen blood before, at the hearth, in the fields, at the very heart of Viking life. The mead-hall was their stage as much as the warriors. They poured the Viking drink that fueled the night. They carved the Viking bread and ladled the stews. They kindled the fire that smoked the meat. But beyond service, they wielded influence sharper than any spear. A whispered word here, a nod there, and the course of quarrels could shift, alliances could tighten, or enmities deepen. So when you think of a Viking tavern, do not imagine only the men pounding their fists and bellowing their oaths. Remember the women serving, singing, bargaining, and watching with eyes that saw through smoke and pretense alike. For in truth, Viking women held the hall together, turning it from a rabble of warriors into the beating heart of Viking life. Their presence was no less fierce, no less vital, and in their silence or their laughter, the smoky glow of the hearth cast its warmth across the long benches, and in that flickering firelight another game unfolded, one not of dice or blades, but of hearts and hidden smiles. Among the Vikings, drink loosened more than tongues. It unbound the hunger for closeness, for laughter, for the spark that leaps when eyes meet in the crowd. Viking men, fresh from raids or fields, leaned across the tables, with boasts half meant as challenges, half meant as bait. Viking women, sharp as the edge of a spear, returned their words with sly glances or cutting replies that made the benches roar with laughter. The air thick with smoke and mead seemed to cradle these moments, as though the gods themselves enjoyed watching courtship play out in the hall. Some Vikings spoke with boldness, declaring their strength, their ships, their victories in far-off lands, hoping that such glory might weigh in their favour. Others relied on subtler charms, an arm stretched just so, a smile hidden behind a drinking horn, a jest shared low between the noise. In the Viking tavern, even a glance could carry the weight of a promise or the hint of a storm. Flirtation here was rarely gentle. Viking men were as loud in desire as they were in war, their drunken bluster filling the space with claims of what they would give or take should the night bend their way. Yet Viking women were no passive figures. They tested, they teased, they pushed back with wit as sharp as steel. A Viking woman could undo a boast with a single laugh, or lift a man to glory with nothing more than her approval. To win such a moment was no less a triumph than victory in battle. And always the firelight played its part, casting faces in shifting gold and shadow, hiding flaws, sharpening eyes, lending to each Viking courtship the weight of fate. The hall's roar would swell around these encounters, sometimes blessing them with song and laughter, sometimes drowning them in jealous shouts. Friendships were tested here, oaths forgotten, pride ignited. For, in a Viking hall, love and rivalry were never far apart, and a hand upon the wrong arm could spark more than desire, it could spark blood. Yet, when the smoke curled high and the fire burned low, there were softer moments too. Viking men and Viking women leaning close, sharing the warmth of stew and the sweetness of mead, the noise of the hall falling away into the rhythm of breath and whispered words. In that haze of smoke and song, flirtation wove itself into the very life of the hall, sometimes fleeting, sometimes lasting, always burning bright against the darkness outside. In the Viking world, firelight and passion belonged together. Both were fierce. The Viking tavern was never a place of quiet restraint, and it took little for laughter to sour into challenge. When words turned to blades, the air itself seemed to shiver, for all knew the thin line between feast and bloodshed. A Viking man might boast of his victories on the sea, his share of Viking food and silver, or the favour of Viking women, but pride is as sharp as steel, and another's tongue could cut deeper than a sword. A jest made too loud, a wager refused, or an oath questioned, and suddenly the benches shook as men rose with fire in their eyes. At first, fists and shoulders spoke before blades did. Viking warriors grappled like bears, their strength shaking the long benches, horns of ale spilling across the floor. The tavern keeper's roar might part them for a time, but once the Viking spirit was stirred, it was like trying to halt the tide with bare hands. Dice scattered, meat rolled beneath feet, and still they pressed, eager to prove themselves in the only way a Viking knew with might and courage before the hall. Yet, when the glint of steel appeared, the atmosphere changed. Knives, once used to cut Viking bread or carve roasted meat, now shone in the torchlight, hungry for flesh. A brawl could be forgiven, laughed off with bruises and broken pride. But when blades were drawn, fate itself was invited to the table. To spill blood in a Viking tavern was no small thing. It called the gods as witnesses, for steel was sacred, and its bite could not be undone. A Viking warrior who reached for his sword was not merely defending pride, he was staking his life and honour upon the edge of iron. The Viking women watched with sharp eyes, knowing that such fights decided more than quarrels. They decided who was truly worthy of song, and who would be remembered as a fool cut down by his own temper. The Viking alekeeper, stern and immovable, might strike with a cudgel or roar for silence, but even his command bent beneath the weight of Viking honour. When words turned to blades, the hall held its breath. Songs died on the skald's lips, wagers froze on the gambler's hands, and the fire crackled louder than the silence. Sometimes blood spilled quickly, a cut across the arm, a man humbled and left to heal. Other times, the clash of steel rang until one fell never to rise again, and when that happened, the Viking tavern itself seemed to shudder, as though the gods had taken their due. Still, even such endings did not empty the benches for long. The Viking people lived with death as their shadow, and to see steel drawn in the mead-hall was but another reminder that life was short, fierce, and meant to be claimed boldly. For in the world of Vikings, even joy and feasting carried the taste of danger, and no night in the hall was free of its shadow. Upon the wall of the mead-hall hung the shield, darkened by smoke and time, yet gleaming faintly in the firelight, as if it bore its own power. To the Viking men who stepped across the threshold, weary from battle or toil, that shield was no simple ornament, it was the law of the hall itself. It told all who entered that within these timbered walls, a man might lay aside his sword, drink his Viking ale, and feast upon Viking food without fear of sudden death. The shield was sanctuary, a promise older than many of the sagas sung within, for a Viking knew that the world beyond the hall was merciless. Roads teemed with ambush, seas with storms, and villages with feuds waiting to ignite. Yet under that shield's watch, the quarrels of the outside world paused. Even enemies, if they dared to step inside, found themselves drinking side by side at the Viking tables, at least for the night. To violate that protection was to defy not only the alekeeper, but the gods themselves, for the sanctity of the hall was sacred, older than kings and jarls, rooted in the marrow of Viking honour. The shield reminded Viking warriors that even the fiercest blade must sometimes rest. Here, in the glow of firelight, they were brothers again, sharing coarse bread, thick stews, and the tang of mead brewed from Viking honey. The benches might be scarred by knives, the air thick with smoke and sweat, but so long as that shield hung, the hall was more than timber and torchlight, it was a fortress of fellowship. Viking women carried horns from hand to hand, their voices rising above the din, and their presence reinforced the law of peace within. For what Viking man would dare draw steel while under the eyes of women who bore both dignity and judgment sharper than any spear? Yet the shield's promise was fragile as the pride of Viking men. When boasts turned to insults and laughter turned to fury, all eyes would flicker to the shield, as if its presence alone might cool the blood. Often it did, reminding men that tomorrow's voyage demanded their strength, that spilling blood in the hall would stain their name more than their blade could ever cleanse. Still, there were nights when the Viking spirit burned too hot, and fists flew despite the law, only to be broken apart by others who knew the weight of the oath, symbolized by that hanging shield. So it endured, through winters of hunger and summers of raiding, watching as generations of Vikings drank, sang, feasted, and fought beneath it. It bore silent witness to the fire of their lives, reminding each man and woman who passed beneath it that the hall was not merely a place of revelry, but of order, protection, and Viking fellowship. The shield on the wall was more than wood and iron. Every Viking tavern, no matter how small or grand, seemed to carry the same quiet mystery, the stranger in the shadows. While the Viking men filled the benches with laughter, pounding fists, and clashing horns of ale, there was always one who sat apart. His hood drawn low, his face half hidden in the smoky light of the hearth, he was not there for the Viking songs or the Viking food, not for the boasts that rolled like thunder across the hall. He watched. He listened. He waited. The stranger might be a foreign trader, his tongue heavy with the speech of distant shores, drawn to the Viking mead-hall to taste its warmth and gauge the measure of its people. Or he might be a rival raider, a man who had once met Viking steel on some far coast and now slipped in quietly, hoping to weigh the strength of those who drank beneath the shield. At times he was no more than an outcast, a Viking cast adrift from his kin, a man whose name was cursed in his own village, but who still found shelter beneath the law of the hall. The Viking women noticed him, their sharp eyes never dulled by the firelight or the drink. They whispered behind their hands, weighing whether the man in the shadows carried silver to spend, stories to tell, or trouble to sow. The Viking thralls, moving between benches with trenchers of meat and mugs of ale, gave him wide berth, for even the lowest servant knew that the quiet ones often carried the heaviest past. And the Viking warriors, quick to pride and quicker to suspicion, kept one hand close to their knives when their gaze fell on him. What made the stranger so unsettling was not his silence alone, but the possibilities that silence contained. Was he a skald in disguise, gathering the threads of Viking tales for some distant lord? Was he a spy, his hood hiding not shame but purpose? Or was he a man with nothing left, nursing his last coin, his last hope, in the warmth of the hall before vanishing into the night? The Viking Tavern, alive with noise and smoke, always seemed to grow a little colder where he Saturday. And yet there was fascination in it too, for in a world of blood feuds and endless raids, the stranger's secrets promised stories as rich as any skald's song. A Viking child might sneak a glance at him and wonder if this was how the gods walked the earth quiet, hidden, testing men with their presence. A Viking woman might wonder if he carried gifts from the east. A Viking man might wonder if tomorrow's raid would see that hooded figure at his side or across the shield wall. So the stranger in the shadows remained. There was no gathering of Viking men that did not descend, at some point, into drunken ritual. Once the horns were filled and the Viking food devoured, the mead-hall grew thick with more than smoke and laughter. It grew alive with tradition. A Viking toast was never a simple raising of cups. It was a binding act, a thread spun between men and gods, sealed with drink and fire. Warriors stood, their voices booming, horns held aloft as they named Odin, Thor, or Freyr, pouring a measure of ale upon the ground for the gods before taking their own swallow. To drink without offering was unthinkable. It would mark a man as coward, or worse, accursed. The games followed. Vikings did not sip in silence. They tested themselves, even at the table. Horn against horn, they challenged one another to drink the deepest draught, to drain the vessel in a single swallow, while the others pounded the long benches in rhythm. Some staggered, some roared, some spat foam down their beards, but all laughed as though such contests were as glorious as battle itself. Others cast dice and bones, wagering Viking silver, a prized knife, or even a kiss from a Viking woman who watched from the shadows of the firelight. These were not games of idle men, but echoes of the Viking spirit, risk, courage, and defiance of chance. Oaths came after, heavy with meaning. A Viking warrior would slam his horn upon the scarred wood, ale sloshing onto the table, and swear by the gods that he would raid across the sea, or slay the man who wronged his kin, or never retreat from shield wall until his bones lay cold. To break such a vow was worse than death, for every Viking in the hall bore witness. The weight of those words, spoken through mead-fueled breath, bound a man tighter than rope, and many a saga was born from such reckless midnight promises. The rituals were not always solemn. Some were raw and wild, bordering on madness. Men staggered through the firelight, chanting half-songs, their eyes glassy with mead, while others carved runes upon the table to mark the night. A Viking skald might twist his verse into riddles, daring the drunken to answer, while a Viking thrall carried yet another round of foaming ale, as though feeding a fire that could never be quenched. These rituals bound the Vikings together as surely as the iron rivets of their ships. Drinking in such fashion was not mere indulgence, it was communion, a weaving of loyalty, madness, and courage into a single moment. By the time the horns were empty and the torches burned low, the Vikings who staggered from the hall were not just drunk, they were the storm outside was a beast of its own, howling across the land with claws of snow and fists of sleet, beating against the timbered walls of the mead-hall. Yet within, the world of the Vikings roared louder still. The wind rattled the roof beams, but it was drowned by Viking laughter, Viking voices raised in song, and the crash of Viking mugs upon scarred tables. The storm might rage against the earth, but inside the hall it found no dominion, for here the Vikings held sway. Each time the door opened, a blast of icy air swept in, scattering sparks from the hearth and biting at the damp furs of Viking men. Yet no one cursed the cold, it was only another reminder of the world they had mastered. Viking warriors thumped their chests, boasting how no storm could drive them to their knees, not when their bellies swelled with Viking food and their veins burned with Viking mead. They shouted to the gods, daring the thunder to split the sky, daring the frost to crack their bones. For what was a Viking without an enemy to defy, be it man or nature? The Viking women moved among them with steady hands, bearing horns brimming with ale, faces lit by the glow of the fire and the challenge of the night. They too felt the storm in their blood, though they wore no swords at their belts. Their strength was in the gaze that silenced quarrels, in the laugh that emboldened warriors, in the songs they carried as clear as the skald's own verses. Even the smallest Viking child, curled in the crook of his mother's arm, stirred and whimpered as the wind keened like wolves beyond the walls. The heat within was thick as a forge. Viking stews bubbled over the flames, scent of pork and onion mingling with smoke and sweat. Viking dice clattered across the wood, wagers rising higher as the storm beat harder. Viking oaths were sworn that by morning some would carve ships from the frozen sea or ride to battle through snowdrifts higher than a man. The storm gave them cause to boast, and boasting was life itself. And so the hall pulsed like the heart of a living thing. Storm without, storm within, each feeding the other. The snow might bury paths, and the wind might scour the hills, but the mead-hall stood bright, a bastion of Viking fire against the dark. There, under the shield on the wall, Vikings remembered who they were, men and women forged of frost and flame, who feasted louder when the storm howled fiercest. The night belonged to the storm, but the hall belonged to the Vikings, and no force of wind or snow could wrest it from them. The hour grew late, and the fire that had once leapt high with fury now burned low, its glow licking the blackened logs with a weary tongue. What had been a storm of sound within the hall, boasts, chants, the clash of mugs, and the songs of skalds softened into a murmur, then into nothing but the slow rhythm of Viking men overcome by drink. The great mead-hall, once alive with the thunder of Viking laughter, was now heavy with the thick breath of warriors sprawled upon the benches. The long tables, scarred with runes and knife marks, bore the remains of Viking food bones, stripped bare, hunks of coarse bread hardened in the cooling air, and the slick gleam of spilled fat. A horn rolled from the fingers of a Viking hand, clattering once before it settled in silence. Beside it lay silver arm rings gambled and lost, forgotten for the moment in the haze of slumber. Viking women who had once moved swift as hawks through the crowd now leaned by the fire, their eyes heavy, their songs stilled. The ale-keeper, who had barked and glared with the authority of a jarl, slumped against the post, the stern line of his jaw softened by exhaustion. Only the firelight kept vigil, flickering across faces marked by scars and years of sea wind, painting them in hues of red and gold. The lull carried its own weight. Outside, the storm had not ceased. It battered, it howled, it clawed. But inside, the Viking hall stood wrapped in a hush deeper than any churchyard. Snores rose and fell like the tide, broken by the occasional mutter of a Viking dream, words thick with battles half fought or lovers half remembered. Some clutched their blades even in sleep, Viking steel glinting in the fire's fading glow, as though they feared the night might yet demand blood. Others lay in heaps, arms slung across comrades, their Viking bonds stronger than any oath uttered while awake. There was peace in this chaos. The hall no longer roared in defiance of the storm, but rested, like a great beast coiled upon itself, saving its strength for dawn. The air was still heavy, thick with the scent of Viking ale, Viking sweat, and Viking meat gone cold, but it was no longer biting, no longer pressing. It was the air of endurance, of men and women who had poured out their spirit and now slept as soundly as if Odin himself had drawn his cloak across them. And so the mead-hall breathed. A living thing, a Viking heart, its pulse slowed but steady. The storm outside could rage until the world was ice and ash, Yet here in the fire's last glow lay the unshaken truth. Vikings did not fall to the night. Sleep in the hall was no gentle thing, yet it was as much a part of Viking life as the clashing of swords or the singing of skalds. When the night's storm of mead and boasting had spent itself, the mead-hall became a strange battlefield of its own, strewn not with corpses but with Viking men sprawled upon benches and furs, their bellies heavy with Viking food, and their minds swimming with Viking drink. Farmers, warriors, and wanderers alike sank into slumber side by side, their elbows still pressed against one another, as if even in sleep the fellowship of Vikings could not be broken. The fire's glow painted the longhouse in shifting amber, warming those who curled near it and casting others into shadow. Some Viking warriors lay across the benches, boots still on, cloaks twisted around them as shields against the night chill. Others chose the rushes on the floor, drawing their furs about their shoulders, their breathing loud and steady. Even the Viking thralls, who had served with silent obedience through the revels, found their corners to rest, though their dreams were far less certain than those of the free. Yet sleep for a Viking was never without vigilance. Daggers gleamed at belts, spears leaned against walls, axes nestled close to roughened hands. A Viking might laugh with his foe over horn and ale, but trust was thin in a world where insult could spark blood. Thus, even in dreams, fingers twitched near blades, and the hall itself seemed to hum with the weight of weapons. It was not fear, but readiness, for every Viking knew that safety was only ever borrowed from the gods, never promised. Among them, Viking women moved softly, gathering horns left behind, setting cloaks over shoulders, or stretching out upon their own furs once the tasks of the night were done. Their presence steadied the hall as much as the fire itself, for Viking men, for all their fury, knew the strength of Viking women who held hearth, kin, and story together. The scent of Viking stew lingered in the rafters, mingled with wood smoke and sweat, reminders of the feast that had filled their bellies before weariness claimed them. The walls, hung with Viking shields, caught the glow of the dying fire, as though the ancestors themselves watched over the sleepers with stern eyes. And so the night pressed on, heavy and long. The storm outside might rage, but within the hall, Viking men and Viking women alike surrendered to rest, their bodies sprawled where they fell, their spirits guarded by steel within reach. The mead-hall became not only a place of feasting, but a vast bedchamber of warriors and wanderers, bound together by fire, by fellowship, and by the unyielding. The morning after was never kind, and in a Viking tavern it showed itself with cruel honesty. The great fire that had burned so fiercely the night before was now only a grey mound of cold ash, its warmth long fled into the night. Smoke still clung stubbornly to the rafters, a ghost of the blaze, while the air reeked of stale ale and sweat. Viking men stirred where they had fallen, groaning as though the weight of the world pressed upon them, their heads heavy from mead and their limbs stiff from stone floors and hard benches. Some rolled over and muttered curses to the gods, while others dragged themselves upright, blinking at the pale slivers of dawn seeping through the smoke hole above. Mugs lay toppled, their dregs sour and sticky across the tables. Crusted bread and bones from Viking feasts were strewn across the hall, gnawed clean and forgotten in the heat of the night. A dog chewed noisily on a scrap of dried fish, tail thumping against the dirt, the only creature that seemed content in the ruins of the revelry. Viking warriors stretched their arms with grimaces, the clink of arm rings faint as they pushed themselves back to life. Their weapons, never far from hand, glinted faintly in the meagre light, reminders that even in bleary weariness, a Viking never slept wholly unarmed. The Viking women who had served and sung the evening before now moved quietly among the wreckage, gathering horn cups and brushing aside spilled stew, their eyes sharp even in silence. Some exchanged knowing looks at the Viking men, who snored with their mouths open or stumbled toward the door to empty their stomachs into the dirt outside. Others set about stirring new fires, so that bread and porridge might rise from the embers to bring strength for the day's toil. For soon enough, the hall would not be a place of laughter, but of labour. Viking farmers would shoulder their tools, trudging to frozen fields and sodden earth. Viking traders would count their silver and prepare goods for the road. Viking warriors, sore and aching, would oil their swords and polish their shields, for raids and battles did not wait upon tender heads. The hall that last night had roared like the belly of a beast now breathed only the low groans of men and the scrape of bowls being set upon the tables once more. Yet there was a strange comfort in it. This was the Viking way to feast like kings when the sun fell, and to rise like slaves to hardship when the morning came. The mead-hall gave them both, fire and ash, song and silence. As the doors opened and the cold air rushed in, the Viking tavern seemed to exhale with them, its night of chaos passing into another day of toil. The mead-hall was no mere house of drink, it was the living heart of the Vikings. To step inside its timbered belly was to feel the pulse of Viking life itself, a rhythm louder than the storm winds outside. Here Viking men and Viking women wove their days together, not only in laughter and song, but in the very threads of survival. The Viking hall was a place where a farmer could sit beside a warrior, where a thrall might serve yet still hear the same songs that bound a king's blood to his people. It was more than stone or timber, it was memory carved into the marrow of every Viking who entered. In the glow of the hearth, Viking food and Viking drink became offerings of unity. Stews thick with barley and fish spoke of toil in field and fjord, while the sweet fire of mead turned strangers into brothers. Each horn raised was not simply thirst quenched, but a bond sealed, an oath spoken, a promise to stand as one when the fjord called ships or the land demanded steel. Viking ale was courage distilled, Viking bread was survival shared. Together they gave strength not only to the body, but to the spirit of the people. Within those smoky rafters, Viking songs rose like embers to the gods, each tale sung by the skalds, a bridge between past and present. Stories of Viking voyages, Viking battles, Viking gods, and Viking love were not idle boasts. They were lifeblood, teaching the young, stirring the old, and keeping alive what steel and fire alone could never preserve. To hear a Viking skald was to feel one's chest swell with pride, to be reminded that even in hunger and hardship, their name would not vanish from the earth. The mead-hall was also judgment and law. A Viking oath sworn by the flame was binding as iron. A Viking quarrel settled within its walls could keep blood from flooding the soil outside. It was a shield of peace as much as a forge of fury, where the rules of kinship and the rights of guest and host were honoured. Beneath its roof, a Viking could find shelter, safety, and belonging, no matter how rough the world beyond. Even as time wore on and kingdoms rose from the scattered clans, the memory of the Viking tavern, the Viking mead-hall, lingered like the echo of a war horn. It was never just a place to drink, it was the fire that bound a wandering people together, the roof that sheltered their voices, the soil where their stories took root. And though the smoke has long since vanished into the northern sky, the spirit of those Viking halls endures in the courage, the song, and the unyielding heart of the Vikings themselves.